Mitch McConnell says the man who leads his party, the former president, should now be held accountable by the courts. But what would that look like? From WAMU and NPR in Washington, this is 1A. Hi, I'm Jenn White. Today on 1A, all the president's lawsuits. Donald Trump has been acquitted by the Senate, but he's still facing a bevy of legal woes. That includes the latest lawsuit filed by the NAACP, the first to center his role in the Capitol riot. He also faces criminal investigations in Georgia, New York, and here in D.C. What lawsuits and probes are looming over Trump now that he's a private citizen? And could he really face financial ruin or even prison time for his alleged crimes? We want to hear from you. Comment on our Facebook page or tweet us at 1A. This is 1A. I'm Jenn White in Washington. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell voted to acquit former President Donald Trump during his second impeachment trial, but not because he thought Trump wasn't to blame for the Capitol riot.
There's no question, none, that President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day. No question about it.
In fact, Senator McConnell said Donald Trump could still be held accountable, just not by Congress.
President Trump is still liable for everything he did while he was in office as an ordinary citizen. Unless the statute of limitations is run, still liable for everything he did while he's in office. Didn't get away with anything yet.
If Trump's fate rests with America's courts, are they up for the challenge? Yesterday, the NAACP and Democratic Representative Benny Thompson sued Trump and his lawyer Rudy Giuliani for inciting the Capitol insurrection. That's just the start of his legal troubles. Donald Trump is facing roughly a half dozen lawsuits as a private citizen, including in New York, Georgia, and D.C. Here to break them down for us are Ilya Meritz. He's a senior reporter at WNYC and co-host of the podcast Trump Inc. Ilya, it's great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
We're also here with attorney Elizabeth Wydra. She's president of the Constitutional Accountability Center. That's a progressive law firm and think tank. Elizabeth, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
We reached out to the former president's defense lawyers in New York and Georgia about participating in today's program. We received no response, but the invitation still stands. Elizabeth, how high is that conspiracy hurdle?
So it's something that the plaintiffs will have to show. But we've already seen from the public comments that we know about, quite substantial evidence of conspiracy to commit this incitement and this violence and the prevention of the constitutional transfer of power. I think one of the things that will be interesting to see is that obviously we don't have to just go on what we know now. The whole point of civil proceedings and criminal proceedings is to uncover the truth. And there will be discovery. That means taking depositions, interviewing potential witnesses, which surely will include former President Trump, seeking documents, seeing, for example, the plans for the rally and any communications between Rudy Giuliani or other members of the Trump inner circle and the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers. So this, I think, will be a very interesting proceeding to watch. And I think it's frankly very appropriate to be using the KKK Act of 1871, especially after seeing visions of the Confederate flag being marched through the Capitol by violent insurrectionists.
In lawsuits about Trump's involvement with the Capitol insurrection, how much will it matter that he was acquitted during his impeachment trial in the Senate?
Oh, it won't matter at all. For better or for worse, impeachment is its own animal. And there are different standards that apply to impeachment than apply to criminal and civil proceedings. Some higher, some lower. But I think, the statement from Mitch McConnell is very interesting because he's essentially saying, hold Donald Trump accountable in the civil and criminal justice systems. And I think, there are multiple types of accountability for Donald Trump's actions leading up to and including the January 6th insurrection. There's constitutional liability, criminal liability, civil liability, and accountability by the people, which, can mean getting, stopping corporate donations to Trump and other people, or, even just elections as well. But obviously, we have seen the impeachment accountability effort fail, but there's also the 14th Amendment, Section 3, which we can get into. And then, of course, these potential criminal charges and the civil suits that we're already seeing come.
Well, we got this email from Andrew who says, please stop focusing on Trump. As a narcissist, he feeds off this kind of attention. There are so many other relevant and productive topics that need to be discussed. Elizabeth, this kind of pushback came up in the impeachment trial itself. Why do you think holding him accountable, especially for something like this insurrection, is important?
I think it's incredibly important for constitutional democracy. We had a sitting president who incited an insurrection, stopped the peaceful transfer of power, something that has never happened before in our history. And we haven't seen the Capitol sacked since the War of 1812. This is a historic breach of the presidential oath to ensure that our democracy is kept safe and ensure that the laws are enforced, including, of course, the constitutional counting of the Electoral College votes, which is, important to remember. That's what was delayed in this January 6th event. So I think it's important, there's a lot of talk about unity and moving on. I think it's hard to have, a real grasping and reckoning with what happened without having accountability. And there are mechanisms for holding people like Donald Trump accountable, and they're in the Constitution, they're in the criminal code, and they're in the civil justice system as well, and I think we should use them.
Very briefly, Elizabeth, and this is very Law 101, but talk a bit about the difference between lawsuits and civil court and charges in criminal court. Which are we more likely to see with Trump?
So I think we'll probably see, I shouldn't say probably. We may see criminal suits being filed by state and local and potentially even federal authorities, but we are already seeing civil lawsuits, the one we talked about with Representative Thompson. And so one of the key things I think to keep in mind is that the criminal justice system, you have to prove your case beyond a reasonable doubt. And the punishments can include fines, but they can also include jail time. In the civil justice system, generally the standard is to show by a preponderance of the evidence what you are charging, and there is not the possibility of jail time being attached. It's more a financial penalty. But for some people, and that might include Donald Trump, having financial penalties is a big deal.
Elizabeth, what limitations, if any, are there around Trump being charged in court for things he did while he was the president?
So with respect to civil liability, there is protections for acts done within one's official duties as a public officer. And, we've seen some rather bizarre assertions of that by Mr. Trump. Ilya mentioned the E. Jean Carroll suit earlier when the Department of Justice lawyers were trying to intervene on Trump's behalf and made a rather odd argument that suggested that defaming Ms. Carroll was somehow within his official duties. But I think, most of the actions that are alleged in these lawsuits that we've seen thus far and the ones that could be filed, it's very hard to make an argument that inciting insurrection is part of the sitting president's official duties. Now that he is no longer in the White House, he is much more susceptible to being held liable because there are limitations on suing a sitting president, although the Supreme Court has been very clear that some process can attach to a sitting president. But now that he's no longer in the White House, he becomes much more vulnerable to liability from civil to criminal proceedings. And, I think one thing that your viewer raised earlier about the jury of one's peers and having these accusations weighed on the merits, Mr. Trump hasn't really had that over the last few years because the accountability mechanisms have been largely political, and he's been insulated by political allies in the Senate. But once these charges are actually considered on the merits, I think he's going to have a very tough time escaping consequence. And I think he might have this feeling of, kind of superpower of avoiding consequence because there has been a failure of the political system to hold him accountable other than through the ballot box over the last 4 years. But I think he might be in for a rude awakening when he comes before a jury.
Well, you mentioned civil liability, and we got this email from Leo who says Trump used his election fraud to grift his followers out of $250 million. Is there any way to go after that money for the victims and to pay for the physical damages his lies manifested? Elizabeth?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think, we could see some lawsuits on that front. There have been charges, I think, with respect to Steve Bannon, Ilya can correct me if I'm wrong, on some of the misuse of funds that were given to Trump's campaign. I think that one was related to the border wall.
That's right. That's what he was pardoned for in the last days of the Trump presidency.
We also got this tweet from Laura who says, as a Capitol Hill resident, what's to stop me and my neighbors from going after him with a class action suit? I've been abused by the actions at my neighbor's house, who's with me. We should note Capitol Hill is a neighborhood in D.C. that's right next to the U.S. Capitol. Elizabeth, how much do you expect to see this kind of action going forward? And is that even a possibility?
Well, sure. I mean, these are things that we still might see come forward, folks who were affected by the insurrection on January 6th, homeowners who faced property damage, for example, people who might have had to, because there were pipe bombs placed in Washington, something that gets overlooked a lot in the reporting. But, it was a terrifying day and there was damage done in lots of ways. And so there could be other civil lawsuits. We've seen obviously the ones from the members of Congress with respect to the interference of their congressional duties, but there could be other staffers, members of Congress on the Hill who were who might have civil suits based on being placed in danger or the trauma it caused to them or property damage.
We're also here with attorney Elizabeth Wydra. She's president of the Constitutional Accountability Center. That's a progressive law firm and think tank. Elizabeth, there's been this long fight between New York prosecutors and Trump's attorneys over access to his tax returns. Trump's lawyers have gone to the Supreme Court twice to block a subpoena for the records. What's their argument for keeping these records under wraps?
Well, their main argument in the Supreme Court was that there shouldn't be, or there should be a heightened standard for the issuance of a state criminal subpoena against a sitting president. The Supreme Court rejected that. But now, of course, that Mr. Trump is no longer president, a lot of those arguments fall by the wayside. Now, I am sure that they will continue to find other ways to fight these efforts to get information, but the main one now no longer applies. And, I think one thing that is important to talk about, both with respect to state and local enforcement, but especially federal potential criminal charges that Ilya brought up before, is that there is this important norm in American society that we don't use the criminal justice system to go after political opponents simply because they're political opponents. And that has been a norm that has been severely eroded by the Trump Department of Justice, where President Trump seemed to think that the Trump DOJ was more like his personal attorneys, and that it really should be independent. But I think it's also important that you shouldn't get off scot-free simply because you are a political opponent. If the facts are there, I think it's important to look at them independently and say, no one's above the law. And it's important that we not use the idea that simply because Mr. Trump was a political figure, that he should be allowed to escape consequence-free.
Douglas also writes along these lines, I heard about the NAACP against Trump last night. How will they find an impartial jury in D.C.? Elizabeth, how big is this jury question as we think about some of the trials that could go forward?
So maybe I just have an overly optimistic faith in the jury system, but I think even if you look at the jury of the impeachment trial, a lot of the Republican senators who voted to acquit said they did so based on, what I think are, frankly, incorrect jurisdictional reasons, that, impeaching a president who's no longer in office, they said was unconstitutional, which, according to both progressive and conservative and scholars in between, is not correct. But they seem to agree, even a lot of those Republican senators, as part of the impeachment jury, that the charges were well-founded. So I don't think that actually the jury question will be as difficult as it might be. I think that, a lot of these charges are so clear. And again, we'll see as further investigation goes forward, of course. But I think that whether it's the criminal or civil liability, or even again, I wouldn't count out constitutional accountability from Congress, because there still is the 14th Amendment Section 3 option to disqualify Donald Trump as having participated or aided or given comfort to insurrectionists. So I think that it's hard to avoid the facts. And once Mr. Trump is actually put to really being held accountable based on the facts or not, we're probably going to see more accountability rather than less.
Elizabeth, we heard the congressman there talking about the commission investigating January 6th. Depending on what that commission finds, could those findings later be used in criminal court or even as the basis for criminal charges?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think, especially if there is substantial fact-finding, subpoena power, which the congressman mentioned, that absolutely could uncover important facts and work probably in tandem with criminal proceedings. One thing I thought was really interesting about what the congressman said, and this commission I think is a perfect example, is that accountability for Mr. Trump and for other people who participated in the insurrection on January 6th is both backward-looking and forward-looking. It's about holding people accountable for this terrible day in American democracy, but it's also about trying to prevent that sentiment from boiling up to the point where you have a sitting president inciting violence and a crowd of people who thought they were acting on his orders violently seizing the Capitol and preventing constitutional democracy from going forward. And then, of course, I was really pleased to hear him link the Protect Democracy bill to this, because there's so much to be done, and accountability, I think, is part of it, to repair democracy. And so, it's not just, I think, and it shouldn't be about retribution. It should be about how we have accountability in order to truly move forward in a positive direction, not just move forward for the sake of moving forward, but to go somewhere good.
Just as we wrap up here, Elizabeth, we know the legal system can take a long time to move things forward. Are we talking about a process of months or years when it comes to some of these cases and investigations?
Oh, definitely years, But I will say, as one of your viewers mentioned, President Trump, when he was president, had a fairly successful, actually, tactic of delaying. He got away with a lot of his emoluments violations, for example, because of that. But once charges are filed, the statute of limitations is met. And so he can't really escape accountability by delaying. But it will, unfortunately, the wheels of justice do turn slowly. So I think we are looking at years.
That's attorney Elizabeth Wydra. She's the president of the Constitutional Accountability Center. That's a progressive law firm and think tank.